Hello, hello. I'm so happy today to have my real inspiration and somebody who has just been such a big part of my journey to be on this podcast. Dana, thank you for joining in. I'm going to give a very brief background. I could talk about you for hours, so I'm not going to do that. So Dana, for those who don't know Dana, she co-founded Biomimicry 3.8 with Janine Benyus, and it's really revolutionizing our existence as humankind by looking at nature as inspiration. Uh, I know that she's worked on a wide range of projects, and I know she's worked all over the world, and companies like Nike, Interface, Microsoft, Boeing, General Mills, P&G. I can just go on and on. I think it's over 100 now, Dana. I think maybe even much more
I
than 100
stopped
now.
counting actually.
You stop counting over.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so going to our background, I met Dana in person in Utrecht, I think 2016, so 5 or 6 years back, and she then inspired me to challenge my sabbatical and pursue a master's, which I semi did. And it was again such an amazing journey. Each time I listened to you, Dana, in those classes, it was just my mind going. The energy that you brought in and the content that you brought in has just changed me and my journey in so many ways. So thank you so much for all of that and all the energy and passion that you bring into the field. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to move to you, Dana. And my first question, of course, you can talk more about the background in biomimicry, but my first question was to start with your early memories of packaging and how they influenced your journey, if there are any. It'll be great to hear
Yeah.
those.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that's probably the first time. I mean, I've been asked about early memories before, but not of packaging. So that was fun to contemplate. And what immediately came to mind, and it sounds bizarre, but I used to have this fantasy as a kid because I was so disgusted by people leaving trash, basically packaging mostly, in wild places. My family took me hiking all the time in the mountains of Colorado and roadside or whatever. And I had this fantasy that one night everybody would go to sleep, and in the morning they would wake up and all of the garbage that they had improperly disposed of would be on their living room floor. Like it would be this, like, that whole out of sight, out of mind thing. It would just be this pile. And we would all have something, right? Like the gum wrapper that you didn't realize you dropped when you were trying to tuck it in your pocket or whatever. But some people would just have piles and piles of like McDonald's cups and who knew what. But I was like, good riddance. Like, may you now have this thing that would just show up. And we'd all know where it came from. So I suppose that's probably my earliest memory of my relationship with packaging. As a kid, I knew I was disgusted, at least what people were doing with it, right?
Yeah, it's amazing how I think it's so ingenious for humankind to have created a product like plastics and the multiple variations of it. But yes, the disposal is such a huge issue, and that's what keeps us going. So let's switch to your passion and the ideas of biomimicry. And I would love for you to rant on about how biomimicry can influence packaging and how do you see that. And you just told me before we started recording that you already did a conversation on this with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So it'll be great to hear more about your thoughts and how biomimicry can be adopted to the sphere of packaging.
Yeah, it's a really interesting space because one of the first articles, I haven't written that much really, but one of the first articles that I wrote with Janine was for the Whole Earth catalog. I mean, and it was way back in the early 90s, and it was on packaging, right? It was how nature packages. And at the time for us it was like, oh my god, I mean, just look at all of the different packaging opportunities in nature. Why are we not doing something about it? And so it goes way back. we have a bio brainstorm in a box. It's like this toolkit that companies can use to sort of run a little mini in-house biomimicry design challenge. And packaging is the first theme that we offered, right? It was a set of biological strategies that would inspire people to think differently, and we did it around packaging. Yeah, and then I found this talk that I had given, and we'll share the link later, for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which of course is really focused a huge amount on circularity, and it was on packaging, right? And so here we are almost 25 years later, and still talking about the question of packaging. And, I've spoken at zero waste conferences, and I've spoken to chemical companies, talking about the role of packaging, as well as end users. In fact, I have a talk this tomorrow for a toy company, and their biggest question isn't about the toys, isn't about the manufacturing, isn't about even the materials they use in the toys. It's about, how do we solve this packaging problem, right? And so everybody's interested in it. I think part of the reason why people are looking for solutions is because it's one of those sustainability challenges that's in our face, right? Every single person on the planet, pretty much, I could almost stand by this, touches packaging every single day, right? And unlike a lot of things, climate, you can barely, you can see the impacts of it, but you can't see the gases. Even energy consumption, maybe you get your bill once a month, but you're holding a piece of packaging in your hand every single day. And so I think it's so prevalent that it's so ripe for innovation. And then the irony is that we've really not gotten very far with it, right? And super frustrating that something that is so pervasive and so annoying has really had very, very little innovation in this space. Even at the time, I don't know, what was it, 5-8 years ago, where just water bottles, right? Like they were like, the arch enemy number one, get rid of water bottles. We still have water bottles. They're still washing up everywhere, and so I'm intrigued by the opportunity, because it's clear, and it's not just the question of materiality, because I think a lot of the focus on how do we solve packaging is it's a little bit looking for the holy grail. Well, let's just substitute this plastic, this non-biodegradable plastic, with a biodegradable plastic, right? Like that's where a lot of energy has gone, when we know that it's just wrought with all sorts of issues and challenges that way. So then the next thing might be like, well, okay, maybe it's not a biodegradable plastic, but it's some other biodegradable thing. And then we don't have to do anything different, right? Because we don't really want to actually do anything innovative and different. So let's just, replace one thing that is scarring the landscape with something that will break down on the landscape, and then it will be out of sight, out of mind, and we can all continue on our merry way. There's an interesting approach to that. In fact, when I think about my original early memory, or early, dream that people would end up with packaging in their backyard, it was actually on a trip to India, maybe in 2012, perhaps. And I was way, way up in the Western Ghats in a very remote village. Homes were made out of cow dung. It was not anywhere near cars, nothing. And it was just this beautiful village in the middle of the Western Ghats, incredible forest around them. And scattered all around these houses was single-use plastic wraps. And I was mortified. And then I began thinking about that it was a really relatively new phenomena. For the village had been there, I think, for 3,000 years. And they had always thrown their quote unquote packaging out the window for all those years. But of course it was banana leaves or, rice paper, whatever. And it just disappeared. And it was really only probably since the 80s that this single-use packaging started showing up. They would walk down to the nearest town, buy their condiments, buy their shampoos or whatever it might be. And then those 3,000-year-old habits of throwing our packaging out the window are hard to break, right? Are hard to break. So I can see why there's some appeal of let's not have to change our habits. Let's just change the material. And then the problem goes away. But that is a big ask. There's so much invested in plastics and their cheapness, right? Of course, there's the whole economic equation of how cheap plastics are. And I think for most companies, and maybe Yash with the exception, which is actually making the packaging, right? For most companies, it's just like, give me the cheapest source of what will do what I need to do. And so it's a pretty big uphill battle when there's a single criteria being used to select what material, what is being used for packaging. And so it feels very distant, right? It feels very distant for many companies to come up with alternatives because they're just like, I'll buy it if it's out there and it's cheap, I'll buy it. And so I think there's innovations clearly that need to be made in the material space. And there's certainly a lot of room for that, a lot of room. But those that need to make those innovations are either, they're smaller players, so it's hard to make those economics work, or they're really big players like Dow and DuPont, and they just have so much invested infrastructure in plastics that why would they want to create a competition for their own material, right? And the demand is just not there yet to really say, do it differently. So that piece of the puzzle, I think, still needs to be unlocked. But I also think at the same time, there's huge opportunities to play with other ways to think about getting rid of packaging, right? And getting rid of why we're doing what we're doing and how we're using it and so on. And that's where companies that are interested in thinking differently about packaging can begin to, chip away at the impact of packaging. And of course, there's things like, reusable packaging or product as the product is both the packaging and the product. But I think there's still a huge amount of opportunity to be really creative in what that space looks like. Like for example, I remember once when in our work with Interface Carpets, and at the time in their carpet tiles, the carpet tiles were shipped in plastic wrap, right? The stack of tiles shipped in some sort of plastic wrap. And they would, of course, be sliced open. The plastic wrap would be thrown away. And then meanwhile, you're opening a can of glue that you're smearing on the floor to glue down the tiles. And the conversation became, well, why can't the plastic wrap go into an old 5-gallon bucket, add some water and, some little magic ingredient, and then it becomes the glue that lays down the carpet tile, right? So there's those kinds of creative ways of thinking about packaging that I think have huge opportunities. And what I think nature offers is those sparks of inspiration to begin thinking differently about how we might go about doing what we're doing. And that's where, I would love to see a team be fully committed to completely rethinking it using nature as inspiration, as opposed to like, if it's super easy and it's a silver bullet and it doesn't cost us more than a penny more per unit, we'll do it, which is just, and then they're full of excuses, like why they can't do it, and it's because they don't want to. That's the bottom line. We can do anything we want to, but we just have decided to not do it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's so real. And then we face it every day, of course, like, oh, this is great, but how much does it cost? And of course,
Mm-hmm.
if it's even 10, 20% more, it's a challenging thing, except sometimes these days, what starts making sense is if it creates brand value for the
Right.
buyer. So then,
Right.
of course, there's a little bit of, and then it depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to the purchase head, then it still doesn't hold sway. But if you're talking to the CEO, it might hold sway.
Hmm.
So it depends on where you're going. But I want to learn more about the idea. So the idea you've mentioned is not that it's not just materiality. It's looking at the whole picture, the whole ecosystem. So can
Hmm.
you guide us more on that? And if you can give a, an example to sort of illustrate how that would happen. Say if, like, you're right, it's not just about replacing one product with another. There may be more nuances to that idea, but it'll be great to learn what on practical terms would you mean by that.
Well, a lot of these things and expectations around packaging are cultural, right? In the United States, we're one of the few countries that likes to like walk and eat our food, right? And because we're walking and eating our food or drinking our drink, it has to come in some packaging in order to go with us. But a lot of other cultures are like, that's ridiculous. Like, that's not very good for your digestion. And of course, what that does is that creates waste, right? Then we have to have garbage cans, and you can always tell an American in many other countries because they're the ones who are trying to walk down the city street with the food in their hands, and then they can't find a garbage can because people don't carry food waste on streets in many other places in the world. Um, so some of it is like redefining and saying, hey, we're just not going to do that anymore. Like that's just not part of our equation, right? So it's like we're making a choice. And because that's what's important to us. Um, I think the quick transformation kind of thing, it's not packaging related, but it shows how quick the transformation. It was 4 years ago, maybe, when trans fats, a couple of papers came out about trans fats, about how bad they were for us. And America jumped on the board. And within 4 months, they basically disappeared from grocery shelves, right? So it was
Wow.
no longer an ingredient. It's like, whew, food companies figured out really quickly. And it went from like in 95% of processed foods in the grocery store down to like 10% in a period of 4 months because America said, nope, we're not going to do that anymore. And so I do think that obviously, I don't know what the equivalent might be in packaging, but if we became disgusted enough, right, because it was showing up enough, then we would start shifting it. I think actually, here's a good packaging one: the take back laws that passed in Europe
Mhm.
quite a while back, where it was that the packaging was no longer the responsibility of the consumer, but the producer. And the producers are like, yeah, whatever, we don't care. But then there was a huge consumer movement where they figured out they could drop the packaging back off at the grocery stores and the department stores and said, you take this back, it's not ours, it's your problem. So then the grocery stores pressured the companies because they had to deal with all this waste now, and they pressured the companies to change their packaging, right? So I think there's some interesting levers that can quickly change, some of these dynamics about what's
Mm.
important. Um, because of just luck, sheer luck, the way the ocean currents work, the plastic doesn't really wash up on US shores. And if it did, you can bet we would have a very different relationship with these plastic bottles and so on, right? Like we would, because it would be there. We would see it. We would talk about it. It would be there. So I think, okay, that's just one level, right? Like that's one level of choice. But then I also think there's some interesting things. Like when I've talked to companies, they often say the number one reason they have packaging is not to contain things, but to market things, right?
Yeah.
And Marketing is all about how much shelf space you have. That's the definition from, well, held over from the 70s of 80s of how much shelf space you have in a department store or grocery store, and that gets you to, people to buy the product. Well, imagine a whole different way where now, of course, with everything digital, you do your marketing online and then you get a very nondescript, very well optimized bottle, box, whatever, that just appears at your door, or you're driving by the window and there's no more walking into Walmart. It's just you drive by and a bunch of brown cardboard boxes get loaded into you because you've done your marketing online. These are the kinds of like flips that we need to get to in order to think differently about how we go about doing this. When I look at nature's, there's all sorts of like in betweens, when we look at optimal shapes for optimal packing. We know that, hexagons and those sorts of things where the packaging actually stays. Like I remember once doing a project for a shoe company that was shipping all the shoes over from Asia, having to ship empty containers back. Of course, you have to pay for that. And because all the shoes, of course, come in square shoe boxes, mostly they were paying to ship air. Right? Yeah. And I said, well, what if the container was hexagonal cells and the shoes just come in a cloth bag that's used for something, could be useful for something else. Even washing the shoes in the washing machine, it comes with the own bag that you can throw it in the washing machine and wash your shoes. And those bags just slip into like bees in a beehive, right? They slip into those different things. And then those hexagons collapse down, and then you're shipping back an empty container, but it's not yours. You're putting something else in it, right? Or, what? I mean, there's all sorts of like where you can use these triggers to begin thinking differently about how we might, have things move. And what shape we use. We did a whole thing for a cleaning company about dispersal mechanisms, like, a big part of recycling,
the
pumps. Yeah. Because there's a metal spring in them. So and there's like different plastics and, yeah. And that's because engineers solve the problem, not biologists, and so we did a whole thing on how nature disperses liquids to come up with alternatives to the pump, right? So that the whole thing could then be recycled, right? That it wasn't a non-issue that you now have all these pumps that have to be taken off or they mess up the recycling chain. So there's little details that you can dive into, and nature for sure probably has some solutions for those. And another one that we faced was the Keurig, the instant coffee cups, where you and of course you've got a food product in there, and food is tough to package because you have to maintain freshness, so you're having to maintain oxygen, and the layers of materials that go into managing oxygen flow are challenging, right? Are definitely challenging, and then that makes the whole thing not recyclable, or in some cases not even biodegradable because of the plastic films that they're using. Also, makeup is in that same category. So beginning to ask, well, how does nature manage oxygenation? And can we think differently and creatively around this? But inevitably, every time you do a piece of that, it's not just because they all want, well, just give me a more benign option B over A, so I don't have to change any more of the system, right? Because they also had a certain way of puncturing the tinfoil so that, and then if you change that material, then they have to change the machine and how it punctures the tinfoil on the top and all these, and they don't want to change it, right? They don't want to change that. So innovations around packaging cannot happen in a vacuum. Just like nature's packaging is not its own isolated thing, it's always multifunctional. The packaging is also the home. It also holds moisture. It also maintains oxygenation. It also camouflages. It also protects from predators. It also expands as the larvae inside grow. Like, it does all of these things. And our packaging it's either really lame and it only does one thing, or if we want it to do multiple things, like a candy wrapper, it's got to advertise and maintain freshness and tear open and provide structure. Rather than designing one material to do it, we design 7 materials and we layer them all together. And then those aren't recyclable because we put 7 random things together. So yeah, again, the potential for me is so huge, but it also requires some dedication of the system to solve for it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I totally get what you're saying. In fact, in our journey, what we realized was, in a way, the opposite. Because we realized, and like you were saying, there needs to be habit change, there needs to be policy change, there has to be the whole ecosystem sort of shifting. And we realized, and we were trying to do all of that and failing miserably because we had no sway and we could spend a lot of money trying to, create more movements, work with schools. What we realized was that we have to ultimately stick to our knitting, which is
Mm-hmm.
basically create more friendly materials and processes. And
Mm-hmm.
then hopefully there will be more people who will work towards. I don't, and I don't know. I'm sort of running it by you. So the idea was that let's just create a lot of good material or better material, I would say, and hopefully there will be others who will come in with, once the material is there, then the ecosystem and the policy and hopefully habit change. And we started doing more of that. In fact, and this is something that I learned from you as well, that you cannot disrupt everything at the same time. So one
Mm-hmm.
of the things that we've started doing now is that earlier, even when we were doing the material change, we were thinking it's okay if we have to disrupt the supply chain, but it doesn't work when there are billions invested in a certain process. So like you were talking about flexible films, our idea now is that let's create an alternate and plug it into the same supply chain and let that just change the material. But like you're saying, it may not be enough to
Mm-hmm.
just change the material. So what do you think? So what I believe is that our karmic obligation is to work towards materials and as a business, and hopefully somebody else's dharma, karma, whatever you may want to call it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is to do the other aspects of it. So what would be your recommendation that we do? Do we look at multiple things, or do we look at what we are supposed to do and, let somebody else come in?
Right. I mean, isn't that like life's biggest question, right? Across everything, right? No matter what it is
That's
that
why
we're
we
trying
asked
to
the
solve.
master.
That's right. That's what we're always trying to figure out, whatever it might be. Um, I think that even those that have come up with the most creative and powerful innovations, and I've seen it in a lot of different biomimetic solutions, not packaging limited, but anything. Um, Even when they've solved that, they inevitably come up with some other system barrier. And so I do think, while you can't disrupt the entire system, um, there's an interesting play at beginning to, definitely develop the alternative and identify at least a part of the system where you can begin to disrupt, right? Where you can start shifting that. So, for example, like with Interface, they developed the ability to take back their carpet tiles and recycle them. And meanwhile, they worked in the state of California to get carpets banned from the landfills. Right? And so they didn't try to take all the US on, they didn't try to take the globe on, but they started with California because that was probably the easiest place to get the legislation in. And then when they became the only one that could grab back all of these carpets, then now suddenly they just got their supply chain that they needed to turn into new carpets. And then, of course, in a place like California, that sells really well, that these are all recycled carpets, right? And so they built, they built their market in that way. I don't know, maybe it was you who told me this story about the along the train lines in China. Was it you that told me that? That stuck with me, that
You mean
story.
the garbage along
The
the
garbage, yeah.
in India?
And how the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
fertility of the soils actually began to decline because all that organic waste wasn't being thrown out the windows before like it had been traditionally. And then you were able to get the rail line to say, hey, we can only use this packaging because look at what you're doing to our rail line, right? So finding those kinds of marketplaces to squeeze in and begin to shift the dialogue. We actually have a woman who's working with us, working at Biomimicry 3.8 now, for her final project in the Biomimicry Professional Program. She asked the question of how can we learn from invasive species, right, from weeds, to disrupt markets, right? How can biomimetic innovations mimic invasive species in order to move into new habitats and shift the dynamic of the habitat, right? So I love the idea of using biomimicry to also inform us in this process of, of what that looks like. And what we see in direct answer to your question is when you're just offering an alternative for an existing thing, then you're actually not an invasive species. You're just you have a tough time getting in because most of those habitats, most of the niches are contained. But if you are able to get in, then you become what's called a naturalized species. And naturalized species are ones that most people wouldn't even recognize as not being native because they've just sort of shown up and they're there. So in the United States, for example, yarrow, many people will know yarrow. It's a flower and it's got kind of a fern-like leaf. And it's actually a naturalized species. It came from Europe. It wasn't native to North America. But it's just shows up in all these natural ecosystems because it's found a niche and it does all right. But when you have a disruptive species, like an invasive species, it plays at a couple of different levels. So one, it may change the resource flows. Something about it changes the resource flows of the system. It's like a lever. It pulls a little lever that has a cascading effect in the system. Oftentimes they have a low reproductive cost and a widespread, so they produce a lot of seeds at a low cost. Like think of a dandelion, right? They may also, if they don't disrupt the nutrient flows, the way resources flow in the system, they can also play with a specific environmental factor. Like maybe they change the pH of the soil, or they change the temperature because they are maybe shading and now it's cooler instead of warmer. But they change some sort of factor. And that's like what interface did. They changed the law that you would think they have nothing to do with, but it actually does play a role in how they go about things. So I think the answer to your question is yes. Keep doing what you're doing, stick to your knitting, get really good at it, and identify, those places to intervene in the system. So one of my favorite articles of all times is an article by Dayna Benyus. I've probably shared it with you, called Places to Intervene in the System. And she identifies 11 different levers. It's like a 10+1 article. It's not super long. And the the most effective, like way at the end, is, changing mindsets, changing paradigms, right? And that's some of what I was talking about before. Let's get rid of trans fats, gone. Okay? Let's decide that garbage is unacceptable, that we don't want plastic bags hanging from our trees, gone. We make that decision. If we want to get rid of homelessness, we could get rid of homelessness tomorrow in this country if we believed that was important. So that's mindsets and paradigms. On the other end of the spectrum, you have things like metrics and numbers, right? You make a case that this is only 3 cents more per packaging, right? And if you think of like a seesaw and you're trying to shift, and you're way over here, you're really close to the pivot point with something like numbers. And so, and then you have to put a lot of weight on that, like to get that to move. So the opportunity for sort of innovative companies like yours that really want to start shifting the system is to identify things further out on that lever. You could play with negative feedback loops. So negative feedback loop would be like or laws and policies. That's a little bit out further from numbers. Negative feedback loops, like the trans fats, like, oh man, this affects me. This is negative. If I eat this, I'm going to die early. Okay, and then it's done. But even better are what are called reinforcing feedback loops. The more you do it, the more it happens. The more you do it, the more it happens. The more once you get into, say, exercise, the more fit you are, the easier it is to stay fit, right? And then that becomes a reinforcing feedback loop. The easier it is to exercise, the more you exercise. And so trying to creatively think about how those things might play out in your world, in your industry, and maybe just pick one that's as far out as comfortable, right? And keep working on the innovation, but you got to intervene in the system at least a little bit.
That's good insight for us, and we are looking at some of that. One of the things that we did was to formulate this platform called Global Compostables Alliance, and the idea there is to enable more producers, but of course, alongside work on things like policy and then, trying to at least do some advocacy, although it's not directly linked to our business. But like you're saying, these can be big changes. One sort of shift, one pivot can, make a big difference. But let me segue more into materials and and see. So if we look at biomimicry, of course, in during my whole time with the masters, the whole idea was look at more materials to get inspired, see, and there were so many. I'm still baffled with the water spider and the corn hulls and the pomegranates and the films inside pomegranates. So it's every day that I get inspired. How can we behave more like that? Are there things that you think of when you think of packaging, and like you mentioned, the multi-layered substrates, which do which do a singular thing, or maybe a couple of things in terms of moisture and air, and some advertising. But do you think of other inspirations within nature that could enable change of materials in the human space, and what would they be, and what would some examples be? Because also for the listeners, we want to take this. Sometimes people think of biomimicry as an abstract theory. So how do you? I know that there is so much that can be done. So I want to sort of filter it down and make it real. That you could look at this and get inspired in this way. So it would be great to hear your views on that.
Well, I can give you, name a couple of sort of innovations in packaging. Like one I remember I thought was really cool. It was a plastic film that had, so there's what are they called? The Venus flytrap, right? So a Venus flytrap is actually held under tension when it's this direction, and then a a hair gets triggered by a fly walking on it, and it snaps shut. That's how it can change so quickly, right? It's not actually a mechanical close. It's a release of this external tension. You can think of a half of a tennis ball turned inside out. It doesn't want to be inside out. It wants to be the other way. So you give it a little trigger and it closes. So they took that idea and put it in a plastic film. And in this case, what the trigger was the buildup of ethylene gases, which are when meat starts going bad, it starts off-gassing ethylene. And that caused the concave could go to convex, which created a color change. So you could very quickly see that your meat was going bad. So here you've got an innovation that's around, food safety. But you can imagine it serves a multifunctional. It's keeping out the bacteria, but it's also giving you some clue about what's happening inside. I think that, ideas that, another one, I can't remember exactly what organism they mimicked, but they were looking at, all those stupid stickers that get stuck on everything and you can never get them off. And it was around get rid of the glue on the back of the stickers and instead using something more like a gecko-inspired structure so that you're peeling it off and you're not leaving any residue. So you're eliminating, the chemistry to that. So, but the most exciting one, and we actually got shortlisted for this project, but it didn't ultimately come to fruition. This was a competition by Kroger's, the supermarket chain, about the plastic bags and the single-use plastic bags. And of course, they wanted to get rid of plastic ones and replace them with compostable ones. Right? And most of the compostable material work focuses on just trying to find a substitute material. Yeah. And as you know this world very well. Different materials are tested, and if they don't work, they're thrown out. Right? They're like, oh, no, not good enough, not good enough. But nobody's really taken the question, and I know that our chemist Mark has talked to you about this, what is it about that material, banana fiber, pineapple husk, whatever it might be, that isn't working? And how can we ask nature for what we need to do to make that fiber work, to help that fiber work, And so there's a lot of deep principles in nature's materials that impart the function that we're trying to find. Like, so for example, people have looked to try to understand why the mantis shrimp is, its dactyl club is so incredibly strong. And the assumption, because we're just so crude in our thinking, is that it's just a molecular story. It's like, just find out what the chemistry of the dactyl club is, and we'll recreate that chemistry, and lo and behold, we'll have this super strong material. But no, yes, chemistry plays a role, but more important, it's actually how the layers are laid down. And it has this helicoidal structure, like each layer is stacked slightly at a different angle to each other. So it's incredibly strong because of that angling. So can we begin thinking about, well, gosh, if we did lay down the pineapple fibers in a helicoidal, does that suddenly give us what we were missing before and why that material wouldn't work? And could we build a whole palette of those nature's structures to then suddenly rethink all these materials that we dismissed, these biomaterials that we dismissed, because they now impart a function. Another good example is spider silk. Again, people just thought, well, let's just understand whatever the chemistry of spider silk is and we're good to go. But it turns out that it's not just the chemistry of what's happening in the vat of the abdomen of the spider, but it's how it comes out the spinneret that lays those fibers down in a certain way, and the spider changes it in real time depending on where it is in the web. Like, okay, the outside one, that needs to be really strong, so I'm going to spin those molecules in this way, and it's going to make it super strong. These I need really stretchy. These I need to, be able to be really sticky. It's the same chemistry. It's just how it's assembled in different ways. And so that, from a purely material perspective, I think is the greatest place to experiment with. Of course, there's the manufacturing question of how do we get our materials to do this? But then that's the next layer to ask nature. Well, how does nature figure out how to lay those materials down? What does that look like? I know that people have succeeded in finding really creative ways to recreate, say, abalone nacre, which is a brick and mortar kind of layer. And no, it's not done the same way the abalone is, but the end result is still that same layering. And as a result, it's super strong. So why not get the material scientists and material engineers, get their creative brains to say, how can you figure out a manufacturing process that results in this kind of microstructure for this kind of chemistry that I'm giving you? Right? I think there's endless opportunities in that space.
You'll be fascinated. You'll be fascinated by this because I had this amazing discussion. I don't know if you know Oded Shozayev at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Amazing guy. It's again amazing. You might want to look up his TED talk. It's really interesting. It's on nanostructures and elasticity, very very related to biomimicry and its ideas. So I had a fascinating conversation with him, and I asked him because I've talked to you before about this. I'm intrigued with the whole microbial multiplication idea, and because one of the big challenges, and this could be my next question, is on the process side. So, we can create a lot of biomimetic design, but many times we use the same metals, the same plastics, the same this to get a certain design, which is great, but then the process is still heat, beat, and treat. So I was asking him, I was rather pushing him to talk about what he thinks about microbial multiplication, and can we use fermentation as a possibility of creating materials or self-creation of materials. And he, again, was very interesting. He said the way he sees the future is multiple baths and a conveyor belt. So a bath takes you, depending on exactly what you're saying, depending on the structure and the substrate you want, the conveyor goes through, say, collagen, and it goes through cellulose, and it goes through, so it creates the kind of layers that is needed. And then, of course, like you were saying, it could be in different directions and different methodologies, and that could evolve. So he was very much in line with what you were saying in terms of the manufacturing processes. But I would love to hear your views on how do we change processes to become more nature friendly rather than the heat, beat, treat idea, because we can create a lot of, like, for us, we can create a lot of packaging from cellulose that will compost, but we are still using like 30 meter cubes of water per ton of material, which is too much. We are still using, 1,000 units of energy per ton of material, and we are creating a lot of waste in the process, heat and solid waste and liquid waste. So, to the consumer, it may appear to be like, oh, this is an eco-friendly material, but on the process side, it sometimes may be even worse than making plastics. So how do you see that evolving from the nature inspiration?
Well, it is going to take, right? So when we look upstream and downstream, right? In all of these questions, well, let me back up. We are not trained in systems thinking, right? It's notably absent from our K through 12 education, let alone our university education. And as a result, this is why we struggle with these kinds of things, because we simply fail to see the interconnectivity of all of this. And it's one thing that I think is probably the most distinctive difference between a Western industrial mindset and a traditional ecological mindset, right? That you find in many of the indigenous cultures around the world, is that awareness, and just like they just cannot not see systems, right? So yes, you're right. It's not just the end product. And in addition to looking at the form and the process and the system, we have to look forward in time and backward in time. We have to look detailed in the scale and, at the macro scale, right? We have to do all of that at the same time, which is, back to biomimicry, why I think it's so powerful, because evolution has worked out a lot of that over time, right? And so there's a lot that we can learn. But more specifically to your question, when the incentives are in place that promote what we want, incentives and disincentives, then those things will fall into play, right? They will definitely fall into play. I mean, we know there's a ton of embodied energy in embodied infrastructure and all of this stuff, which makes it really hard for companies to change any of their manufacturing processes. And so there's going to be a place where some things are just going to have to die out. They're just going to, unless a company makes a conscious decision, like I know one of Interface's was, when they had a major line, length of a football field, a manufacturing piece of equipment that they needed to replace, they designed it to be adaptable, evolvable over time. So they didn't ask for a single piece. They asked for one that they could plug and play, and that would be amenable to a wide variety of raw materials coming in, and that they could take off this vat and add a new vat, right? Like, so they had in mind the ability, as technologies evolved, as needs evolved, to adapt that, right? So companies need to have that in mind, because otherwise they're just going to go extinct, right? That's just not an option. And it is the young startups that didn't invest in the capital costs of the $1 million archaic machine and are saying, wait, I want to make this system of vats where I can just run my packaging through, and I'm going to grow my packaging, like Ecovative, or I'm going to have a very scale skeleton, and it's going to be a dip and go, right? And then it self-assembles on there. I do see a lot of trend and a movement towards what we call bioassisted technologies. And of course, much of the bio-based is bio-utilized, where we're asking nature for help because we're kind of crude in our abilities. I think there's ways in which that can be done poorly. And I think there's ways in which that can be done better than that. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that we are enslaving organisms to help us, and be really mindful about what that means. Just no different than we have ethics around, the conditions for chickens, when we're eating chickens. I think it behooves us to think the same of the microbes and the fungi and other things that are assisting us. Simply because it's the old mindset that we simply followed that path before and assumed that all of these other organisms were there for us to consume in some form or fashion, or enslave, right? So I do think that there's some interesting avenues, but the right kind of ethos and I think humbleness is a really important piece of that. Not just assume that we can go in and tweak the genome and expect that we're going to contain it all. And, it's just some hubris that is really not very healthy for all of us. But at the same time, I do think there's some really interesting hybrids that can leverage our existing manufacturing, can find ways. Like I did a project once that was for a food product, and because we helped them tweak an ingredient in the process, they were actually able to eliminate the drying ovens altogether, right? So for them, even though they had the capital infrastructure, if the drying ovens weren't running, they weren't burning any energy. So that was like, well, that's a no-brainer. We'll just take that out of the line. It's faster. We just get rid of it, and we're done. And so I think there's some intermediary steps that might get us to the places. And I also think there's like really creative ways to use some manufacturing equipment from some industries and completely repurpose them into altogether different kinds of industries. Um, and, so we can take that embodied carbon that's in there. Like, I can't remember what they did with it now, but Germany had a whole system of transforming coal fired power plants into renewable something. I can't remember, but it was super cool. So it wasn't like a question of jobs and no jobs and all this stuff and coal or no jobs, but it was like, no, we still need you all to work in this manufacturing facility. We're just not going to produce CO2 anymore. We're going to do X, Y, and Z with all this equipment. So I think thinking creatively about those transitions will be important. Maybe a facility isn't making packaging anymore, but now it's making clothing out of that same kind of equipment, and packaging is made over there in the soup factory, or whatever, because they had the vats. I don't know. But we're going to have to move into that space. And I mean, the thing that hasn't been mentioned and just needs to be mentioned, we could just do to stop consuming quite so much stuff.
Oh my gosh, yes. That would definitely be a good starting point.
Let's start there. And then we could have probably the biggest impact on packaging across the board if we just seriously reduce consumption.
I wrote an article once on no packaging is the best packaging. And that was one. And the other one was that, we don't have to take about care of the earth's health. All we need to do is take care of our own, and the earth will be healthy, because then you won't eat processed food, you won't eat packaged food, and
Exactly.
a lot of that will enable the change that is required in the planet.
That's exactly right.
Two things that came to my mind, and this is just something that would interest you. I was sitting with an Ayurvedic doctor, and of course, they take the pulse and they tell you what is wrong with you rather than you giving them symptoms. And they look at the five elements and see the imbalance and see what is wrong. But I always thought that it was mostly the pulse and the eyes. But he actually told me it's 18 things they look for. Even the way you walk, the way you sit, the way you talk, your tonality, so all those things. And then he suddenly goes, there's a bee that came in while we were discussing. And he said, why did this bee decide to come in now? And it was interesting. It's the idea of systems thinking that sort of happened there. And, even looking at what is happening, there's nothing that's happening without a reason. So that idea, and you're right, in our education, we somehow are educated out of that. We become specialists in one domain and do not look at the things around, and we don't know there is always a reason why something is occurring. And so it was just fascinating to have that experience. And but again, taking a cue from, you mentioned Ecovative, and of course, Gavin and Evan have been dear friends, and the amazing work they're doing. And in fact, Gavin and I had a conversation recently, and he talked about. So I was thinking, I was questioning him on scaling. I said, it's great that you have this whole mycelium idea and you're creating these products. How do you scale? Because you are still limited by size. And it was very interesting how he talked about it. And when we think of scale, we think of mega factories. You need to have this big thing. So he was talking about not just multiple smaller factories, production, or as he calls it, what is it, like uh, vertical agriculture kind of an idea. That's what he calls it. These multiple sites. But he also talked about the community coming in, and how they are giving these kits away, and that is enabling the communities to produce. He said we get multiple new ideas every day of how mycelium can be used, which is again fascinating. It's a very different thought process to scale, because of course the size of the challenge is large, but there are multiple ways to solve it, not just mega factories as we think of it. So are there other ideas that you think of when you think about scaling those ideas? Like it could be mycelium and it could be chitosan or whatever it is.
Yeah.
How do you see scaling happen? And things being
Yeah,
solved.
I kind of bristle when I hear the word scale because we tend, in fact, I was just talking with our managing director about this the other day. It's like, don't use the word scale because it sets up an expectation of exactly that. Just make the same thing bigger or make the same thing 1,000 times over, right? And nature scales all the time but doesn't do either of those things. But we're so limited in our perception about what scale means. um, and where it's all about market share and getting rid of the competition and all of these things, the mostest, the superlatives that we use all the time. And if we thought about it in a different way in terms of, well, one, when is enough enough? um, but also the question of, well, if our main goal here is to completely disrupt the industry, then our impact of scale is about having this show up in as many different forms and across as much a different space as we possibly can, each one being locally attuned, right? Each one matching what's happening in that space. I'm not sure if I shared with you before, but and I haven't seen much about it, so I'm not sure what happened to it. But Zelfo came up with a piece of equipment, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago, that was uh, about the size of a desk, and you could put in all of your scrap cellulose, right? Waste, our ag material, and so on. It didn't use heat, it didn't use beat, it used pressure, but it was self-generated pressure. And the way I sort of interpreted it was like a roller, like a clay slab roller in a ceramic studio. You just use the pressure, and it encourages at the molecular level the cellulose to bond in ways so that what comes out the other end is a sheet good, like a piece of bio-based cellulose ag scrap building material, like sheet good. And what I loved about it was that it didn't matter what cellulose material you put in it, and it was something that could go to all of these different local communities. They could all put in their stuff, roll out, and now you have another wall for a house, or whatever it might be, because it was based on the fundamental common material of cellulose,
Hmm.
which is everywhere, right? Cellulose
Yeah.
is everywhere. um, and so thinking creatively about, well, their version of scale was making this unit, but then could they play with different features, like, well, maybe the roller isn't smooth, maybe the roller has a texture in it, and now you have an extra feature, an extra functional ability to this sheet good that comes out at the end. um, and then now that can become widespread, or it becomes, that you're selling the blueprint and people are building it in their own communities, right? So I think I think the move towards more local everything, locally sourced, locally built, locally designed, locally attuned, locally made, is really where we have to go. And we have to rethink that question of scale altogether.
Scale.
All of the problems that we have on the planet today, they were not big, huge top-down problems that were imposed on us. They were all emergent problems of lots of cars pumping out CO2, lots of people throwing their plastic off over their shoulder, like and so the solution to all of those problems have to also start at that small scale and be emergent coming up.
So interesting. I look forward to at least Gavin's work becoming very similar to what you're saying. They are already doing, and I'm so excited about that making the change, because exactly the things that you're talking about were the things that he mentioned in the process in terms of
Mm.
local fiber. We don't know what the local fiber is. What is
Mm-hmm.
the local need? What is the product that
Mm-hmm.
is needed, etc., etc. I know that you're pressed on time, so I'm going to go
Okay.
towards the final two questions, and the second to the last being, like you mentioned, ecovative. Are there others that you're seeing making a big shift? And it could be people in this domain, or it could be companies who you think are really taking the whole idea of sustainable packaging or regenerative packaging and moving it forward in the plethora of people that you meet. And I know that you meet people from so many domains that it's probably difficult for you to catalog that this is packaging. But
Yeah.
I don't know if people come to mind to you.
You know, honestly, I haven't tracked packaging lately. I haven't paid that much attention. You know, since the pandemic, there's been a few other things that were bigger and more prevalent for people. We're doing a lot of work in the built environment and factories and large scale stuff right now. So I don't have an easy answer for that. I've sort of trickled out things that have caught my attention in the past, but I'm not aware of anything immediately that's come across my radar. Yeah.
Okay. And so the last one. If you were to define good garbage, what is it that comes to your mind? How do you see good garbage playing out, and how would you see that influencing the way we live on our planet?
Well, I always like to say that when it comes to nature's version of recycling, which is, you know, people always say there's no waste in nature, and everybody's like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then they never actually look at what that means more deeply. But the reason why there's no waste in nature, why there is no garbage in nature, is what is the most interesting. So for me, if we were to say good garbage, it would be materials and processes that follow the same reasons why there's no waste in nature. One of it, which is that nature uses the same fairly small subset of the periodic table. And whether it's an eagle's feather or an abalone shell, it's the same base, like carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, a couple trace elements, right? So I think one thing we have to get to is just significantly reducing how much of the periodic table we're leveraging in our materials. Because then someone's waste becomes the raw materials for something else. But the only way that that can happen is based on the third law of thermodynamics. The amount of energy that we went into putting those materials together is approximately the same amount of energy necessary to take those materials apart. So when we heat, beat, and treat, we're pumping a lot of energy into squishing those molecules together. And now it's going to take a lot of energy to break those molecules apart. So we've got to change the way that we process this, you know, these materials so that they can come apart more easily and therefore be more useful. So that's another part of that equation for good garbage. And then the third one is to recognize that it's a system. It's a flow of nutrients in the system. And that system actually involves multiple players. It's not just a, tree's not turning its leaves back into itself and the tree's 100% responsible for it. That doesn't happen. You know, when leaves fall off a tree, other organisms are breaking them down. Those molecules are spreading. They're ending up in other organisms. Like maybe a small fraction ends up back in trees. So we've got to have the producers and the consumers and the decomposers. And the decomposers, there's like many, many different layers in the steps of decomposition. So I think the good garbage is part of a good system of moving and processing nutrients. So yeah, that would be my version of good garbage.
Illuminating as always, and you brought in the tree, which is again complete conversation in itself, and there's so much that we can learn from it. Thank you, Dayna. Thank you for sparing the time, and as always, being so eloquent and clear about the direction we need to take. It's always an inspiration for me, and
Thank you.
I'm so sure that people who listen to it will again get excited about this possibilities of utilizing and being inspired by nature. So thank you for taking the time. It was short notice. Thank you for being here and having this wonderful conversation.
I'm happy to chat with you. Thanks for inviting me.